Hello and welcome to the course. I'm your host today, Julie, and I'm speaking with Professor Howard Nusbaum from the Department of Psychology. Professor Nusbaum is the Stella M. Roley Professor of Psychology at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on wisdom, language use, attention, learning, memory consolidation and sleeping, and working memory. He is the Master of the Social Sciences Collegiate Division and the Deputy Dean for the Social Sciences Division. He's also a member of the Committee on Computational Neuroscience. He is here today to talk to us about his career path and how he became a University of Chicago professor. Welcome to the course, Professor Nusbaum.
Thank you for inviting me, Julie.
Can you start us off by giving me a general overview of your career path from your college years to becoming a professor at the University of Chicago?
Sure. My college years. Well, I went to Brandeis University as an undergraduate, thinking that I might actually study psychology with Abraham Maslow, but he was dead. I didn't know that because we didn't have Google back then. But I went actually to study artificial intelligence and psychology, and there was no computer science degree at Brandeis when I started in '72. So I had to start out majoring in physics, which I was not very good at. So I did end up finally, when there was a computer science program, in majoring in computer science and psychology. And as an undergraduate, I actually did some work in artificial intelligence on a National Science Foundation grant. And then I went from Brandeis to graduate school in cognitive psychology at the State University of New York at Buffalo in '76. And I was there for 5 years working on speech perception and perception and attention. And then in 1981, when I received my PhD, I went to Indiana University in a postdoctoral position that was funded by the National Institutes of Health. And I was there for another 5 years. And then I came to the University of Chicago as an assistant professor. And I've basically been here since with a minor excursion for 2 years in 2015 through 2018 at the National Science Foundation as division director for social behavioral and economic sciences for the division of behavioral and cognitive sciences.
And we'll dig into some of those specific experiences in a moment. But before I do that, can you tell me a little bit about your specific area of study, what your research focuses on, and what you're particularly interested in?
Sure. So I've always been interested in perception and speech perception and learning. And so broadly speaking, we sort of hid in my laboratory that people in my laboratory study learning the unlearnable. In part, that's because some of our work has been for adults to learn to perceive speech that is hard to understand, to learn to perceive it better, to learn to perceive absolute pitch as absolute pitch, which is supposed to be something you need to get as a kid, and then even to learn to make wiser decisions. And so a lot of our work has to do with learning. A lot of it has to do with perception. And we're sort of interested in the plasticity of the human, that is how experiences can change us.
Looking back on your younger years, and I'm thinking even before college, I'm thinking more middle school, high school, were you interested in language? Were you interested in psychology? Or were you interested in things that maybe weren't called that, but that you can see the connection to where you ended up going? What were some of the early influences for you as a young person?
Well, my dad was an engineer, and he worked at the Illinois Institute of Technology Research Institute. And he did a lot of government contracting. And when he would drive me to school in the morning, or we'd go anyplace, he'd sort of talk about his research and he'd ask me about alternative hypotheses. And so I kind of got to start pretty young, even before 5th grade, just thinking about science and reasoning about science. And then my mother was a psychology major in college. And so she had a bunch of psychology textbooks. And when I was a kid, I started reading those. And then my dad had some books on computer programming back in the days when it was mainframes and Fortran. and I started reading those. And so I got very interested in the notion of psychology, just sort of thinking of the mind as an unusual thing to investigate. I guess when I was a very young kid, I was always interested in science. And then I became interested in psychology. When I was in what we called in lab school, so I went to University of Chicago laboratory schools in sixth grade. And around the time that I finished sixth grade, before I started pre-freshman, they called it, I started learning hypnosis. I just was interested in the notion that maybe you could focus attention in some way, concentrate the mind and improve learning. And so I started doing little studies myself using hypnosis. And then in high school, actually built a Skinner box, which is a kind of device for measuring learning in rats. And I did a yoked design trying to see if rats could learn temporal intervals like an hour. Can a rat know how long an hour is? So those were sort of the early days when I was actually interested in psychology. So I've always been interested in science and always been interested, and for a long time interested in psychology and the mind and learning.
Did you ever have the sense that you would want to become a professor when you were running these experiments and creating these things when you were younger? Or what was your career aspiration? Did you have a sense of what you'd want to do with your interests?
That's pretty weird because I always thought I wanted to be a scientist. Now I didn't think about that as being a professor. I just thought I like science, I like doing research, I like asking questions and finding out things that nobody knows. So I always thought about myself as doing research and being a scientist. And my dad, who was an engineer, was actually doing applied research. So I had a sense of that. And he was at IIT in the Research Institute. So I had a sense of what it meant to be a researcher. My uncle was actually a pretty well-known researcher in clinical psychology, Saul Garfield. And he had positions at Teachers College in New York and then at University of Washington in St. Louis. So I sort of understood what it meant to be a professor, but it wasn't until I went to college that I really started thinking about what it meant to be a researcher as a professor as opposed to just doing science. So I wouldn't say that I wanted to be a professor when I was young. I would say I wanted to be doing science, and then I learned that, hey, one way we can do this is by teaching as a professor.
I'd like to hear about some of the important mentors you've had throughout your life. It could be maybe a family member like your uncle, or a teacher or professor you had when you were a student. But who were some of the people who have most influenced your career?
Well, first and foremost, I would have to say my dad. I mean, my dad always had an interest in science and sort of encouraged me in that. And like I say, we would have these long conversations about his work, about science in general. He's the one who encouraged me to learn computer programming back in the 60s, which is just a little unusual for an elementary school kid to be learning computer programming. So my dad sort of started me thinking about science systematically and engineering and building things. And then I think one of the most influential people when I was a college student was Art Wingfield, who was a professor of cognitive psychology at Brandeis University. And he would just talk to me about research. I took his class in experimental psychology. I actually was not a great student as an undergraduate, so I took his intro to psychology class very early on and got a C in it, which did not dissuade me at all. But taking his class in research methods was for me a very deep experience in thinking about cognitive psychology and mental representation. And then another professor, Jim Lackner, who taught a course in psychology of language, even though he didn't really have much interest in it. He got more interested in vestibular systems. Jim Lackner's course in language got me very engaged in thinking about a number of problems that have continued on in my research even to this day. So both of them, even as an undergraduate, in terms of the work on memory that I do and learning from Art Wingfield, and the work on language and top-down processing and the way we conceptualize things, Jim Lackner, they were very important. When I was a graduate student, I had a number of mentors. Naomi Weisstein was just an incredible researcher. She essentially invented the term cognitive psychophysics. the idea that the way we think about the world, our high-level cognition, actually shapes the low-level perceptions we have of the world. She was incredibly influential, not to mention the fact that she wrote these essays about feminism in research and academia, and she was in a rock band. So she was kind of an impressive person all around. And faculty members like Irv Biederman and Jim Pomerantz, who studied visual perception, they strongly influenced me as well.
Can you tell me about any challenges you faced in your career or resistance, maybe just or self-doubt? It could be a time where you questioned your career path or met resistance from your peers or something like that. But what have been some of the challenges that you faced and how did you push through them?
Well, two of the most challenging aspects of my career, one has to do with just the career itself. So when I was a graduate student coming from the State University of New York at Buffalo, I did not have many publications. I had a few. I had a handful of publications, a few first authored, but jobs were hard to get, and it was just a difficult time during the Reagan administration. And so I ended up with a choice between going into industry and being like a human factors engineer at AT&T, and I had several offers from AT&T research labs, or going into a postdoctoral position. And at the time, some people in psychology went into postdocs, but not a lot of people. And so it sort of felt like it felt like a challenge to not move on to a faculty position. But I ended up doing that because I decided early on that if I didn't get to do my own basic research, ultimately, I would kind of be regretful about it. And so I chose to go to Indiana. But the other thing that sort of happened was when I went to Indiana, some of the first projects that I was given had to do with very applied topics. So it was sort of like doing work that I would have been doing at AT&T, but doing it in Indiana University with Dave Bizzoni. And the first thing he wanted me to do was to work on some problems in applied speech technology. And he actually sent me to give talks. And the people in speech technology were wonderful. And I started thinking about problems there. But when we first started to develop these papers in sort of the human understanding of computer-generated speech and use of speech technology, very hard to publish them in psychology journals, in basic psychology journals. So they went to more engineering-oriented places. And so I was challenged by that because I viewed what I was doing as basic science. And the field didn't really accept that learning could take place for speech in adults. And so that was a serious challenge, both for the work that we were trying to do and then for the jobs that I was trying to face. Ultimately, it was almost serendipitous that I got the job at the University of Chicago because a faculty member came down to visit Indiana University, and we spent the day talking about science. And then she was the one who sort of engineered me getting an interview at Chicago.
Was the prospect of teaching and working with students something that was appealing to you about pursuing an academic career, or were you more drawn to the idea of research? Can you tell me about how those two elements of the job kind of drew you in?
Yeah, I was always a bad student. I never had that good grades, and it was very difficult for me to sort of focus on and study things that I wasn't intrinsically interested in. And so I didn't think a lot about being a professor in terms of teaching. I just thought about doing research. When I was at Indiana University as a postdoc, ultimately I was able to teach a couple of classes, and they were really disappointing experiences. Like, I wrote out every word that I was going to say in a class, and I would basically try to make clear the tensions and trying to understand new knowledge and trying to test theories. And the students at Indiana were always just clamoring to be told the truth as if there was a single truth in science. And so that was really disappointing. And yet, when I came to the University of Chicago and I taught my very first class, I pulled out the notes that I had written out the whole lecture. I think I said the first sentence in my notes, and the students started asking me questions. And it was like a revelation. It was like seeing academia through new eyes. Teaching at the University of Chicago has been one of the most engaging experiences I've ever had in my life. It always instructs me. It always keeps the way I think about things fresh. The students are such a joy. And so early on in my first real academic job at the University of Chicago, I learned that teaching was as rewarding, if not more rewarding, than doing research.
What would you say is the most fun part of your job right now? You're kind of alluding to it, but I'd like to hear you talk about it in more detail. What is really fun or joyful about your current position?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, serving as master for the Social Sciences Collegiate Division, I'm sort of in a position where I have responsibility for undergraduate education at some level in the social sciences. And I wouldn't say that's fun, but I am currently teaching in the MIND course, which is a social sciences core course. And that is fun. It's an incredible joy to basically hear my colleagues talk about the kinds of problems that are viewed at a very big level, like what is social interaction? You know, what is the nature of mind? How do we construct reality as perceivers of the world? And then to talk about it with 19 undergraduates who are all engaged and smart and creative. So I think teaching in the mind, teaching the core is one of the most engaging and happy things that I do. But of course, the other thing is the research that we do. My lab, the students in my lab, the graduate students and the undergraduates that come to work in my lab are all incredible. They're colleagues. I don't think of them as my students. I think of them as colleagues and collaborators. And indeed, when you think about that, when you think about students that way, coming to the lab is just a joy because you get new ideas all the time. You have conversations that are challenging, that make you think about the world in different ways. And then we do new studies that we get to work out and see the results from. And getting to see new data is always a joy.
The opposite of that, is there anything about your current job that is less fun or tedious, or that is, something that you don't necessarily look forward to doing?
That's an interesting question too. I don't think what happens in a day-to-day situation is the tedious things you either put off a little bit more or you get them over with quickly. I think at some level, the less fun things are having to give reports, administrative reports. So for example, I have to give an administrative report on the status of the Social Sciences Collegiate Division. And while I like talking about the Social Sciences Collegiate Division, and the data themselves are interesting, showing how instruction is being staffed currently, the growth of social sciences and interest in social sciences in the college, it's kind of not so much fun to give a report like that because it's sort of like reporting on your taxes.
You mentioned, did you say you had a brief stint at the National Science Foundation? Is that?
Yes.
Yes. Can you tell me about that experience of working for the National Science Foundation and what you did there and how that differed from your current career as a professor?
Sure. So I was asked to serve on review panels. Those are panels that look at submitted grants and basically evaluate them and make recommendations to program officers at the National Science Foundation for funding research. And I had done that a couple of times, and it was interesting enough that the person who invited me to be a program officer, to sit on the panel that she had as a program officer, she had been the teaching assistant for a class I took at Brandeis in psychology of language. So I'd known her for a long time. Serving on the panel was a joy. It's fun. You get to talk to colleagues. You get to look at proposals to do new science. And I did that a few times. And then she suggested me for the position of division director. So at the National Science Foundation, the person at the top of the agency is the director. And then under the director are directorate heads, the assistant directors. So like social, behavioral, and economic sciences is a directorate. And there are divisions within that directorate and division directors. And so I was a division director for behavioral and cognitive sciences. And that has 11 programs, or had 11 programs when I was there, that ranged everything from geographical sciences, linguistics, anthropology, archaeology, to cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, social psychology, et cetera. And so those 11 programs are staffed by PhD program officers. And my role was basically the director of a $100 million division.
And so you were there for 2 years and then you went back to being back to the University of Chicago. Is that the timeline?
Exactly. So the positions as division director are called rotator positions often. Sometimes now they're more permanent, but I was in what was called a rotator position, which is they bring in people from academia essentially to have vision about the current science in the field and to provide leadership in terms of scientific developments. And so when I was there, we developed a program in my division that was moving over from another place called the Science of Learning. We developed new research programs in things like ancient DNA. And so being as a division director meant you got to sort of think about leadership in the field of science, in your sciences, but also think about how to allocate funding to support those fields. It used to be the case that the University of Chicago only allowed people to be gone from their professor positions for 2 years. It turns out I could have probably stayed another year, but being away for 2 years from my lab and from the Center for Practical Wisdom, it just started to be too stressful, and so it was time to come back.
What are you currently most inspired by in either your work as a professor or in your research? What are some of the questions or things that feel like they are really interesting and exciting to you?
Well, it's interesting because that changes a lot almost on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I've been having conversations with historians as part of their hiring process, and I find that incredibly interesting that historians come at understanding the past not as a kind of not as like writing new stories about the past, but as a kind of empirical social science investigation, finding the evidence to support different theories of understanding the way human history has unfolded. I find those kinds of conversations very inspiring. But of course, for me, talking to my students is almost always the thing that gets me excited every day. Some of our research is looking into the nature of consciousness. One of my graduate students, John Viet, is actually working on the problem of how we can look at neural data, how we can see how neural activity is related to the sense that you were in control of an action versus the action just happened. And trying to find out what are the brain signals that indicate that you're actually thinking that you're doing something versus it's being done to you. So those kinds of questions are quite exciting. But the funny thing is, one of my other graduate students, Katie Reese, is working on nap studies right now. She's trying to understand whether a nap can protect your memory as well, just as well as a full night's sleep can. And in doing so, it means that we've actually reached out to a former student from a long time ago, now a full tenured faculty member at Michigan State, Kim Fenn, and we're working on new projects together, trying to think about what it is about a nap that could consolidate learning and memory, and how the process of consolidation takes place.
Do you have specific things that you would like to do in your career at this moment? Things that you are maybe looking forward to or hoping you'll have the chance to do? Is there anything in the future that you're really excited about or really hoping that you'll get to be a part of?
Well, the work that we're doing now on using brain electrical activity has been a long time goal of mine. From when I was a graduate student, we were able to talk with researchers who were sticking electrodes into non-human animals to record from single electrodes to understand how those neurons in the brain were operating. The work that we're doing now is on the leading edge. This is work by Letty Ho in my lab, on the leading edge of decoding what neural activity actually means in terms of your experience. And together, John Viet and Letty Ho and Katie Reese are all working on these fundamental problems. The question is, where do we go from here? And I think the work that we're starting to do on consciousness leads us to be thinking about things like hallucinations and and how the mind constructs interpretations and what meaning is. Those scientific questions, I think, are extremely important and very exciting. And that's where I think we will be going next.
A lot of our audience are graduate students or undergraduate students who are interested in pursuing an academic career or starting to think about what their career might look like. What advice would you have specifically for students who are interested in pursuing an academic career in psychology or in a related field? What would you want them to think about or do while they are young or while they are still in school? What sort of things would you encourage them to keep in mind at this phase in their life?
There are two things that I think that are most critical. The first is to get involved in doing research, almost any research, and to learn from doing that research. It's true that, a lot of times you get started in a research laboratory and you're basically like lab furniture, just sort of moved from here to there and collecting data. But getting engaged in the material questions behind the research are very important. So I think the first thing is to get involved in research and ask about the research, understand the publications that led to that research and why people are thinking about those problems. But the second thing I almost always recommend to all students is to start reading research material. That is to just pick up journals in science and read them. And it doesn't matter if they're journals in physics or journals in chemistry, journals in biology, journals in psychology. Just reading science regularly and what people say about science, I think, is incredibly important. Those two things, getting involved in research and reading about science, I think is very important. And I don't just think it's important if you want to be in psychology to only read psychology. I think it's important to read about sociology, to read about history, to read about biology, and to try to understand how people think about science generally.
My last question for our conversation today is, what is the most gratifying thing about your current career? It could be something about your specific field or about teaching or about the University of Chicago, but what do you think is the most gratifying part of your current job?
It's hard to answer in one simple question because being at the University of Chicago has been sort of an incredible joy on its own merits, just because everybody will have a deep conversation with deep insights. And so one is constantly learning, and that's just wonderful. But I think really the answer to this question is working with the students at the University of Chicago. The students at the University of Chicago are smart, creative, thoughtful, smarter than I am, certainly, and a joy to talk to. And so every one of those conversations is something I learn from. And those are things that sort of keep me engaged in my profession and in the motivation to keep working on research the way I do.
Professor Nusbaum, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Julie. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you again, Professor Nusbaum, for your time today. And course takers, if you enjoyed listening to today's interview, please check out the other ones. Leave us a comment, subscribe, follow, and share this episode with your friends and family. You can find out more about the University of Chicago through uchicago.edu or the university's campus in Hong Kong through uchicago.hk. Stay tuned for more. See you around.